We are live, Madam Chair.
Okay, we're ready to convene the policy subcommittee meeting for September 23rd, 2021, pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order, suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law GLC 30 AS 18 and the Governor's March 15, 2020 order, imposing strict limitation on the number of people that may gather in one place. This meeting of the Shawsheen Valley Regional Vocational Technical School District Committee will be conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. For this meeting, members of the public who wish to listen or watch the meeting may do so by accessing the meeting link above. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event that we are unable to do so despite best efforts, we will post on the Shawsheen website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. Roll call, Mr. O'Donnell.
Here.
And Ms. Kim is on her way. And I should announce at this point that Mr. Peterson has resigned from this committee due to his responsibilities as chair of the superintendent search committee, which is pretty awesome stuff. So, should we wait on the minutes until Christine arrives? Can we approve with just 2 people?
Where only 3 were present, it'd probably be best to do that at the end of the meeting if we can.
So let's wait for her.
Make a note to
Okay.
come back to that.
Yep. Okay. All right. So would you, Mr. Superintendent, would you continue, please?
Sure. So if I will share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. So before we go forward in our review, I wanted to go back to page 2 and review and correct an error that of information that I provided the committee under the apportionment section of the policy. The question arose as to whether the source of the current apportionment of quotas of seats. And I erroneously informed the subcommittee that the source of that decision was the regional agreement. That was incorrect. The source of those quotas are school committee policy and exist in current school committee policy. And so what I did is I put this language in red, which is actually out of your current policy, which says the initial allocation of educational seats is made on the basis of town quotas. These quotas are set by the school committee through this policy and have been determined by historical application patterns. The current town quotas are as follows. And then those are the current town quotas that we have been using since 2007. So I just wanted to circle back to that issue and answer any questions you might have about that.
All right. So the school committee, meaning our school committee.
Yes, the Shawsheen School Committee.
And that was in 2007.
That was when the policy was last it was at least reviewed in 2007. I don't know if the numbers were changed in 2007 or if they were I can't find any history going back any farther.
Can you expand on what historical application patterns means?
That's not language that I wrote. That's language that's in your existing policy. I think it probably means at the time it was written that those were approximately the ratios of applications that Shawsheen received from the 5 communities.
Well, is this something we can revisit and review?
It is.
I would like that to be done. I find those numbers a little off balance. I don't know how we would establish new ones, but I wish I knew how these were established.
Well, I suspect historical application patterns, we probably have the data going back a couple of years that says 4% of the students applied from Bedford, 40% of the students applied from Billerica, et cetera. My recommendation would be to leave these numbers alone for the first year. This policy, and I know I sound like a broken record, but this policy is only establishing the quotas for the incoming freshman class. And they can be changed, and the policy has to be reviewed by law every year by the school committee. And it would be my recommendation to not change these numbers right now, because there are some implications to the application process that I think all members need to thoroughly and completely understand.
Well,
but that, of course, that's up to the school committee.
How would we revisit that? And you're saying this would apply for the current year?
For the year that, if the school committee accepted these numbers, these would be the quotas for the next fall's incoming freshman class for the initial part of the evaluation. These quotas benefit communities that do not have numbers whose current numbers are less than the quotas and do not serve there are others who you have to rob from Peter to pay Paul. So it is a very tricky situation. I think the other reason these numbers were set this way was because they purposely benefited applicants from Bedford and Burlington, which supported, probably at that time, a committee objective, which was to increase participation from those 2 communities. So these numbers support efforts by the communities of Bedford and Burlington to increase participation from those 2 communities.
And are we currently at 10%, pretty much?
Who's we?
Bedford?
Bedford is, in terms of, no, you're not. No, Bedford is not. Nor is Burlington at 16.
Oh, it's the freshman class. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of everybody. Okay, right. It's still low.
Well, yeah. This is an important issue, and it does have ramifications beyond just current admissions, and it is a zero-sum game to an extent. But is it fair to say, Superintendent Jackson, that to the extent that certain communities are not hitting their quotas, those spaces are made available through a mechanism to the other communities?
Yes, and I'll point that out when we talk about, when we're in section 9 of the policy. I can point that out.
Right.
I can also it's very important for me to point out that the 5 communities pay for Shawsheen, not using these ratios, but using the actual ratios of students. So for example, Wilmington has a quota of 17.53. Let's say, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I bet you 25 to 30% of our students are from Wilmington. So Wilmington actually pays 25 to 30% of our budget. On the other hand, Burlington has a quota of 16. They probably have, let's say, 8% of our students. So they're not paying 16% of our costs, they're only paying 8% of our costs. So this only impacts the admissions process. It does not impact the allocation of our budget to our 5-member communities. That is done on the actual number of students in proportion to the total. And that's important for all 5 communities to recognize and understand.
Right. Yeah, it would seem that there probably does need to be an independent discussion about how these numbers relate to different purposes, and also to the extent that they get re-examined, whether you're looking at a 5-year, you want to look at a 5-year average, or you want to do it on something like the census, a 10-year average. And to some extent, maybe you want them to be aspirational, where we would like to see the numbers get, as opposed to sort of restricting based on past lack of applicants. But because it is a zero-sum game to a certain extent, and we have other communities, and particularly right now, there are 2 folks from Bedford in the discussion with you. We probably do need to look at that independently and decide whether these should be adopted, but also for how long, and when should they be re-examined, because it does have some, obviously budgetary and even longer term as we look at issues such as facilities, upgrades. They do have other ramifications.
Well, and just so you know, the allocation of capital costs,
Right.
There is something in the regional agreement about the allocation of capital costs, and there is a 10% minimum for each member district. That is part of the budget process. So this is a very complex conversation, and one where I would, first of all, my initial recommendation is that, first of all, by law, you have to look at this every year. So this is part of the policy. It can be examined every year.
Right.
My other recommendation is that this particular piece of the policy should be discussed by the whole committee and not by the subcommittee, because it is imperative, in my view, for good regional relations and relations among the region, that all 5 communities be represented in that conversation. That is, to me, essential. So I would never recommend that this conversation take place in a subcommittee meeting, because there are, by definition, there will be some communities that will not be represented at the subcommittee level. So I would, when the time comes next year, hopefully, that, this would be a conversation that would be deferred to the whole committee.
Well, just as a question of information, you will be presenting, I assume, a part of this to the committee meeting next week? Or are you only going to give them a summary of what we have done?
I have no, I think we can talk about that later this evening, about what you'd like. I have no preconceived notions of what what, if anything, we would present.
Okay.
Traditionally, we wouldn't present anything until we have a vote by the subcommittee to recommend something. We can certainly give them a, a status report. That was my initial thought, but
I mean, I assumed we would just give a report of what we've done, a summary of what we've done so far, very briefly.
yes.
But I would really like to have have an asterisk next to it. I think it should not be just rubber stamped every year. It should be examined and discussed in full. If not this year, then certainly next year. But as
I agree.
Brian-
I agree. This is an important issue.
Yeah, as Brian said, there's a lot in there too. So how do we proceed on this? Just leave it as it is? The other question was, what is this regional agreement that we keep seeing here? Is that something that came from the beginning and is reviewed, or is it a relatively new document?
So the regional agreement was written in 1950 blah when the region was formed. It talks about the makeup of the committee, how the committee is the school committee, how the school committee is elected. It talks about the relationship between the district and the regional school district, which is Shawsheen, and the 5-member communities. It has a process by which it is amended, which requires approval from the executive board of each community and/or town meeting of each community. So it is a document that the school committee, it's basically the document that authorizes the school committee to do its work. But it is a document, and it's a document that the school committee can recommend amendments to, but cannot make amendments to. I think you have to make a recommendation. The whole process for amending the regional agreement is outlined in the regional agreement. And I was under the assumption that that was sent out to everybody as part of your welcome package, but
I don't know that I ever
somewhere.
saw that. Brian, do you have a copy?
I mean,
of
it's
No,
it looks like
Yeah.
this. It's
I don't think that has been included in,
it goes back to 1966
That's quite a document.
and has been amended 3 times.
All right, I was just going to ask you how often it's been amended. When was the most recent?
The most recent amendment number 1 was made in 1973. Amendment number 2 was made in 1973, and amendment number 3 was made in 1974.
So it hasn't been reviewed in that intervening time, or it's been reviewed and just continued as is?
I don't have the answer to that. I don't know.
Okay.
I'll get a copy of the regional agreement out to you.
Okay. I think we should all have it. As you said, it should be in our packet.
It actually, I've been meaning to do this. It should be posted on our website also.
Oh, okay. That's fine too.
With that in mind, let me go through continue with the review. If I could, I'd like, so we ended our conversation on page 8. I want to bookmark the issue about the numbers in terms of the maximum points and return to that. But so I wanted to go through. We were on page 8. We had reviewed the interview questions, and I said we were putting together a rubric for scoring the interview questions. And that rubric has been now and been updated and is in the draft, is in your draft that was in your packet. So we developed a rubric for each of these questions where a student would get 0 points, 1 point, 3 points, or 5 points. And it's basically the scale, if you will, is relevant. Again, we're trying to, I want to circle back. We're trying to find the students who would benefit the most from the unique offerings that Shawsheen Tech has. So you can see here that, for example, question number 3, assume you attend Shawsheen. What do you see yourself doing after you graduate? They'd get 0 point if they didn't respond to the question at all. They'd get 1 point if they provided a limited or an irrelevant response. They'd get 3 points if they indicated a specific vocational or technical program that will lead to a career college readiness with no reasoning. And then they, in other words, oh, I want to be an electrical. And then indicates a specific program they want to be in with reasoning. I want to be an electrical because I've watched my dad do this or my mom do this, and this is something that interests me. Or so again, it's a progressive scale and a rubric. So those are included in the packet, and probably something, I'm happy to answer questions. The rubric was developed by the administrative team, and we spent quite a bit of time on this to provide specificity to each question, and the way each question would be, the answer would be scored, to try to eliminate as much subjectivity as possible.
Brett, I assume that might be part of the reason why, and I personally see some benefit to this, but why you went from the 3 points to the 5 rather than having a gradation at 4, on a thought that you really didn't want to be, it might not serve a lot of benefit to be making those distinctions. But I didn't know if is that something that was specifically talked about?
Well, there is not that much gradation in these types of answers. So, the ability to move from a 5 to a 4 to a 3, there's not really 6 grades of answers here.
Right.
Again, the most important thing is that everybody is, we use the same rubric for everybody. So you can say, well, they don't deserve to lose 2 points. Well, everybody would lose 2 points. So it's all relative when you are summing the scores of people. That's why we did that. We did that one time earlier in another rubric around the narrative question for the guidance counselor that I just scrolled up to here, 0, 1, 3, and 5. Because again, we didn't feel, I actually had written a 6-point gradation, and I was looking, and I basically ended up using adjectives that were synonyms, but different words that meant the same thing. So they're really, between a 1 and a 2 was just the words were different, but they meant the same thing. So that's the interview. So that basically sums the whole process. Now for the grading of each application. So I'm going to try, God help me here. I'm not going to do it because I was going to try to bring up another document, but I don't know if it's going to work, and I'm just not comfortable trying it. So I do have that before and after, Nancy, that you had asked for about the numbers. I'm starting to build a PowerPoint to
The side by side, yeah.
side by side, and I'll go back to that once I'm done with this
Okay,
document.
thank you.
So let me go through the selection process. And I'm going to read this to you because it does, this is new. This is not new in the fact that this is what we currently do. So using the guidelines delineated in the selection criteria above, points are assigned to each respective criteria, and then points are totaled for each applicant. After a point total for each resident applicant has been determined, all resident applicants are placed in order of their point total and town of residence. So in other words, we create 5 lists. 1 in rank order for Bedford, in rank order for Billerica, Burlington, Tewksbury, and Wilmington. Applicants are selected in accordance with their criteria, point total, and the quota of seats assigned to their respective town of residence as outlined in the apportionment section. So in other words, if there's 340 seats, we go down the Billerica list until we've hit whatever the number of is apportioned, 32.44% of the size of the freshman class is. And then applicants are selected according with their criteria, point total, and the quota of seats assigned to this town of residence. All applicants are either accepted or put on a waiting list. This is, I actually want to work on the order for this because I think these paragraphs are a little out of order, but so all fall applications must be submitted by February 1st. Late applications will be deferred to a separate ranked waiting list, and students will not be accepted until the original applicant list is exhausted. That's really important. That's our current process. We don't take somebody who scores better but applied late. So prior to April 15th, students are ranked and accepted. That's our goal, to notify students they've been accepted or they've been placed on the wait list. On April 15th, any unutilized, this is the piece about the quotas being too low. Any unutilized seats by town will be filled based on the ranked wait list regardless of resident town. So after we accept up to the quota, we take the 5 waiting lists and compress them into 1, regardless of resident town. So they're ranked by their grade regardless of town. So we create a new list that has students if there are leftover seats. And then we fill based off of that waiting list. And then if any exist after July 1st, then we go outside the district, which we haven't done in a long time. All students are notified of the status by the end of the current year. Students who are on the waiting list may be accepted at the end of first or second term of grade 9. Eligible transfer candidates for grade 10 or 11 will be accepted on a space available basis when vacancies occur in the vocational area of their choice. This was another issue we had talked about earlier. So they can apply, but if they want to get into electrical, they're not going to get in because it's full. So it's when vacancies occur in the vocational area of their choice. In the event there are more acceptable candidates and spaces available, a waiting list will also be maintained for each technical program. And that waiting list will be based on the rank order of the student's total criteria points. So that's basically how we accept kids. So, and I would accept certainly questions, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm confused. You have 5 ranked lists, correct? For each, a list for each town ranked.
After
the
February
applicant.
1st, we score and we
After they've
conduct
been-
all the
yes.
interviews. And then we have to complete applications. We've reviewed disciplinary records, attendance records, assigned all of those points. Then we create 5 lists from
right.
100 for a Bedford list that starts at 100 and goes down to 0. A Burlington list that starts at 100 goes down to 0. Billerica, et cetera.
Well, is it conceivable that, I'm trying to visualize a list, that the points on the, say, 15th kid in one town might be higher or lower than the 15th kid in the other town?
That is not only conceivable, it is highly probable.
And so is at any point, would a student be eliminated from their town's list? What is the minimum they have to have, or would they automatically be on as long as the list is still has a place?
There is no longer a minimum score.
Okay, right. So that means as long as they are on the ranked list and there are seats available, that student will be admitted.
So let's take a example. Use hyperbole to take an example. Let's say there are only 2 applicants from Burlington who scored a total of 10 out of 100 on their they're scored a 10 out of 100 on their using discipline and grades and those 5 criteria. And there are 400 students applying from Billerica who all get a 90 or above. We will fill 32.44% up. Once we hit that line, we will stop accepting Billerica kids, and though all of whom have 90s, and the 2 kids from the community that I mentioned, I'm not trying to pick on a community, but I'm just picking one, would get in. So you can conceivably have students who score a 40, get in from one town, and a student who scores 80 not get in from another.
That's a concept that I think would be difficult for some parents to accept. I think it's really important to convey that. It's only fair, but it's difficult.
That
It
has
is-
probably been happening to one degree or another for
It happens every year.
40 years or 50 years.
When you have quotas,
Yeah.
you can't help but have that.
Well, I won't go into the fact that that makes for a very uneven classroom.
Well, that's what, I mean, quotas, the quotas are established by school committee policy. So at some level you could, I'm not recommending, I don't think this is the time to throw a lot of the baby out with the bathwater here, but, I don't think there's anything saying you have to have quotas at all. But I think that is again, a decision that should be done with a sizable amount of thought and debate, and not something that should be done when you're kind of under the gun to establish a new, we have to start our admissions process, and we can't until this policy is approved. So I do not think this is the time to do a wholesale change, but that process that I just described has been in place for 40 years.
Well, I guess when we revisit that regional agreement, it might be more revealing on how these things were arrived at, and maybe they're just not up to date anymore.
It's not in the regional agreement.
Okay.
Yeah, whether you would want, in essence, to be saying, well, for a certain number of slots, a child from Bedford or Burlington is going to compete, and it has to beat out, quote unquote, beat out every kid from Burlington, from Wilmington, Tewksbury, Billerica, or basically say that that's an implication that may have some other very negative consequences in terms of the district being a cohesive whole, I think.
It's a very I agree. I think there's this is it took a long time to get to this place.
Yeah.
And it is I have been in regions that are very dysfunctional, and it is the most miserable experience ever. And this is kind of we're at equilibrium, and messing with equilibrium is very, very tricky.
Well, I'm
And
sure there's a lot of thought that went into establishing these numbers, and people with a long memory might be able to help us understand. I mean, I've only been on for a couple of years, so I don't have
the only
long-
people, I mean, perhaps Ms. Muse or Mr. Peterson might remember. I'm not sure.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions on the
Yeah, one, Superintendent
Selection
Jackson, slightly different scenario, which I think probably wouldn't play out very often, but might. Let's assume that you've done the town by town. There are 20 extra spots between Burlington and Bedford based on some recent historical gaps of not using their full allotment of seats. So there's these 20 extra slots. At that point, you're going to a waiting list that is done irrespective of town.
correct?
So in theory, all 20 slots could go to Billerica kids, or all 20 slots could go to Wilmington or Tewksbury. At that point, if the town by town is pretty much out the window, and all of those slots could go to one community or only two communities or some disproportionate number.
They will go based on, in 100% based on rank order of how their applications were graded.
Okay.
So the towns
Regardless of
are
community.
started at that point. It's strictly on the points.
Yes,
Okay.
because we don't hold a quote. We only hold the quota through April 15th.
Right.
Then if we give unused seats away, regardless of the community. There were some times where Tewksbury didn't meet quota or didn't use their whole quota, I suspect. Maybe, I'm not sure, but frankly, historically, the two communities that haven't been using their quota has been Burlington and Bedford.
Okay.
All right. So this policy also talks about our exploratory program. So basically what this is so this policy does two things. How do you get into Shawsheen? And then once you're in, how do you select your shop? So we are moving to that part. How do you select your shop? So we use something called an exploratory program, which is it happens for all ninth graders. They from September through the spring of their freshman years, ninth graders explore a variety of distinct programs for up to one full week during their shop week. Before the school year begins, students identify and rank order 20 different programs they'd like to explore that we offer. These preferences are considered when developing the grade-wide exploratory schedule for the school year. We can't guarantee we'll get every student into 20 the 20 that they want. But we do our best to get them in as many of their top priorities as possible. Each exploratory shop has a capacity, and if you have 360 freshmen, and each shop has a capacity that equals 360, so everybody's got to be every student's got to be in exploratory every week. So it's quite possible that in 1 week, a student may be in an exploratory that wasn't even in their top 20. And that's not necessarily bad because these are ninth graders. And it's been my experience that some students go, oh my God, I never really understood what advanced manufacturing was. And now that I'm in it, this is the best thing since sliced bread. So, you know, people who come into Shawsheen with a plan, their kids, they oftentimes change those plans. So at the end of each week, the assigned exploratory teacher, so there's a electrical teacher who is from the electrical shop who teaches the electrical exploratory. There's a teacher from the advanced manufacturing shop that teaches exploratory. So there's a single teacher from each shop. They have a standards-based holistic rubric that's specific to each program that basically talks about how they performed in the program during the week. And then each rubric also has to contain a method to convert it to a 100-point scale so that we can give them a grade. So in other words, they may get up 16 points, but we have to convert that to a 100-point score, 100-point scale, so they can get an A, an A minus, etc. The resulting numeric grade is entered into the student record. So they get a grade for each week, and it goes on their report card. And is the key variable in the selection process. So this is the selection process. So after all the exploratory programs is done, sometime in March or April, after completion of the exploratory cycles, students are then asked, okay, what are your top 3 choices for shops? And they give us their first choice, their second choice, and their third choice. And we make sure they have both their grades and they remember all their grades, because their grades are very important in establishing priorities if shops are oversubscribed. So students are placed in their permanent vocational technical program based on their interest, grade, which is from the section above, and shop capacity as follows. And that should say section 8, I think. At the end of so they provide their 3 courses. The student is placed into their first choice.
That's an extra.
Unless the number of students who chose that program exceeds capacity. So let's take cosmetology. Let's say it has a capacity of 30 students. If 24 students selected cosmetology as their first choice, they get in, regardless of their grade. Okay, is everybody following this? Everybody, there's 2 of you, I'm sorry. So if interest exceeds program capacity, students are then rank ordered by the grade they receive in the exploratory cycle for that program and are offered placement in that program until capacity is reached. So let me take another example. So let's say electrical. I use electrical a lot because it's a very popular program. Let's say electrical has a capacity of 30 students. And let's say, which is oftentimes the case, we had 40 students indicated that electrical was their first choice. So now interest exceeds capacity. So those 40 are rank ordered by their grade, and we take the first 30. And then that shop is closed for everybody else. And this also talks about how we do ties. So if there's a tie, If each student got a 90 in their electrical score, we take the average of all of their exploratory programs. So let's say they went to 15, they had 15 exploratories. Take the average of their 15 exploratories, and whoever has the higher average gets ranked first. This motivates students to do well in all of their exploratories, not just the one that they think they're most interested in. So students who don't get into their first choice will be placed into their second choice, provided program capacity was not reached by students who ranked it as their first choice. And then this rinses and repeats. Students who not get into the second choice will be placed into their third choice, provide program capacity was not reached by students after satisfying each student who indicated SHOP as their first or second choice. In the instance that a student does not get placed into their top three choices, the student and their family will be provided with a list of SHOPs that have openings so the student can select their permanent SHOP from that list. So this is the most emotional part of a student's, there is a lot of stress during this portion of the process by the entire freshman class and their families. And I can tell you that maybe 3, 4, maybe up to 5% of our students do not get placed into their top three choices. And it is a very difficult message for us to give. These shops, however, capacity is not a variable, it is a fixed number. Capacity is based on safety. And the number of students that we feel can safely participate in a shop or can fit into the space safely. And each shop has its own individual capacity. So electrical has a capacity, plumbing has a capacity, Cosmo has a capacity, engineering has a capacity. They're all separate numbers. So that's the basic process. There are, however, wait lists and more wait lists, right? Any student who does not get placed into their first choice has the option of being placed on a rank order. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we do wait lists, I want to also talk about a nuance of this process. So let's talk about that electrical example. Well, actually, let me go through the waitlist piece, and I'll use that as the example. So any student who does not get placed in their first choice has the option of being placed on a rank ordered waitlist by the grade they received in the exploratory cycle for that program should openings occur before the end of their sophomore year. If a student wishes to be placed on the waiting list for their second choice, they will be rank ordered by the grade they received in the exploratory program for that program behind all students who are on the wait list for that program who selected it as their first choice. So in this case, their choice is more important than their grade. So if a student said, so let's talk about those 40 students who wanted to be in electrical. They move to their second choice, they get their second choice, but they want to be on wait list for electrical. They're on a wait list based on their grade, those 10. Then you take all the second kids who put electrical as their second choice, and you put them on the wait list below them, again in ranked order, but you do not re-rank the first kid. So you could have a student whose first choice was electrical and got a 90, would be above a student who got a 95, but ranked electrical as their second choice. Because we think choice is more important than grade. So you have to kind of rank these, you sort them in a certain order. And we sort by choice first. So that's another important nuance to the selection process that we do our best. The guidance counselors work diligently with families to explain this process. Some think there has to be a strategy involved in selection. I don't. I think it is very program specific. But in the shops that are very competitive, I can see a student who really wants to be an electrical, but get an 85 grade. Their second choice is HVAC, but they got 100. They might be counseled to get into HVAC because by the time if they picked electrical first, they probably wouldn't get in. And then by the time, if HVAC were their second choice, it might have filled up with everybody whose first choice was HVAC. So all of these nuances, and this has taken me quite a long time to learn about this process, but we do our best. And in spite of those efforts, I think there are always families that are disappointed, but we have to have a process. And this is the challenge with, this is kind of trying to find that sweet spot between how many students do you accept, 360. Well, that's going to create, when you create a bigger freshman class, there's going to be your capacity of your popular, I don't want to say popular, but your traditionally highly sought after shops don't change. So you increase the number of students that may not get into the shop they want. It's a very delicate balance.
You have spent a lot of time explaining this, and I'm still struggling. Who explains it to the parents and the kids with this detail? It's really hard to get all this from the print.
Guidance.
They have the time to sit and explain this?
The freshmen, when they are given their, first of all, this is a topic of conversation. The parent water cooler conversation. This is and the student conversation. There's a lot of this issue is. It's kind of like the conversations that take place around college applications. People talk about strategies, and it's a process that really dominates a lot of conversations during the course of the freshman year. And a lot of the upperclassmen talk about their experiences to the freshmen. So there's a number of resources they get, but when they first sit down with together as a group and are explained, pick your first, your exploratory program's coming to an end, pick your first, second, and third choice. Here are your grades. That's why we specify we want to give you their grades so that we can go over it with them. And then students are given the opportunity to speak with their guidance counselor specifically about their own situation.
And this is done on a one-on-one or in a group environment?
Both. The it's traditionally done on a group environment with students having the option of circling back for one-on-one assistance.
I would imagine, I think you had freshman, it was a freshman orientation was last night at the school. I would imagine that it comes up a lot there.
Yep.
with parents.
Everybody's jockeying for position.
There must be a lot of misinformation flying out there as well, because
I wouldn't venture a guess without any data.
Two related questions, Superintendent. You identified a 3 to 5% of students still not getting any of their 3 top choices. Are there a number of students on an annual basis, and I know you haven't had a chance to see this over a lot of years, are there some students who just make the decision, well, then maybe Shawsheen's not the place I need or want to be if none of my choices are being realized here? Is it a cause, to the extent that you know of some students just making decision to go elsewhere?
I don't have any specific data to that, but I don't think that's unreasonable to assume
Okay.
that happens.
And I guess the other historical question might be whether or not at the point at which, and as you referenced, because some of these things are driven by capacity, which is limited by the capital, by the physical plant and the number of sections and the number of hours in a day that you can offer, you don't have the ready capacity to expand capacity for whatever is most in vogue or most sought after. I'd be curious to, historically, this can be discussed another time, whether or not there's ever have been decisions to expand programs specifically because the demand through this process was sufficiently high, and therefore you could project out a year or 2 or 3 that it was going to continue to be there, and therefore an additional section or some other accommodation needs. I realizing that's hard to do, and it's harder to do in some shops than others.
It is, and we have, we do provide some fluidity to that. For example, this year we added a plumbing teacher. So we expanded the capacity of our plumbing shop because they were able to reconfigure their physical space. They rebuilt it in such a way that they could accommodate more students physically, but we needed another teacher to provide instruction. But those are few and far between. They're a little more, there's a little more flexibility in some of the shops that don't have as much of a direct connection with a physical setup, that are more classroom oriented, like our ISSN and programming. We could just find a classroom, fill it with computers, add it. I'm not saying it's this easy, but that's a little easier than basically creating a whole new electrical station for 30 students. So there is some flexibility. Again, shop selection is a zero-sum game as well. The trick is you also have to you can't just add shop teachers with the same number of students, because then your budget is going to start getting uncomfortably high. So you also have to look at low interest shops, and over time be prepared to make difficult decisions about closing shops. I mean, for example, many years ago, the health wing didn't used to exist. Part of it used to be the small engine repair shop. That was a shop a Chapter 74 program that Shawsheen offered. Its interest waned to the point where people made a decision to say, you know what, we're not going to offer this anymore. We're going to offer these health because there's interest, et cetera. That's a very, very, that's a strategic decision. So we're constantly monitoring this for capacity. There was, while it's hard to imagine today because the building trades are in such incredibly high demand, but they weren't always in high demand in terms of employability. We also have to make sure that, our goal is not just to put kids through a shop, but to put them through a shop that's going to result in them having a successful career in that chosen area. So you've got to take, sometimes employability comes into consideration as well.
Tying the admissions in back to the application process, however, we are, I think as we've gone through this, we're not specifically giving any weight or advantage to a particular applicant based on the shop he or she is most interested in, or clearly has some background or, prerequisite skills. So I guess I would throw the question, do you believe, and does the team believe that that remains the best approach to not even take that into consideration? Or would there be some point at which, when it comes down to whether it be waiting lists or other circumstances where you may want to take it into consideration and therefore make it less likely that kids are coming in and might run up against that frustration of not being able to get any of their choices? That has its own potential downsides. It's like, there are college admissions people will tell you, people are applying, they say on their application, I want to major in Greek because nobody else is going to major in Greek. So it enhances the chances of getting in.
And then they changed pre-med.
Right, or something like that. So I'm just wondering if there's any thought to whether or not that should ever be part of admissions, either in the general pool or at the waitlist level.
I actually can't recall any. I think again, this particular iteration of the admissions policy review is basically trying to codify what we're currently doing.
Right.
I think philosophically, personally, that I think one of the foundational concepts of Shawsheen is that every student walks in the door with a clean slate. And that to me is an incredible benefit. And to have the admissions process carry over into the shop selection process, in my opinion, flies in the face of that foundational element. I think that, and I think we also personally, again, this is my personal opinion as an educator, I think we have to give kids the opportunity to change their mind. They're 14.
Yeah.
We don't want them to make life decisions as 7th graders or 8th graders. And as it is, we're asking them to make life decisions at some level as 9th graders. But from my opinion is we should delay that as long as possible.
Thank you.
All right, so this next part is actually open. So there is an appeals process by regulation to for people who are unhappy with either decision to be not accepted or placed on a wait list, or the decision about their shop. And the regulations are a little vague. Currently, the appeal goes to the principal, not to the superintendent director. I'm ambivalent to that. I want to make sure Christine is.
I thought it was the guidance and the principal.
No, this is the appeal.
I thought I had read in the other one that said the appeal went to the principal and to the guidance.
Well, the appeal, I don't remember actually, but hold on, please. No.
I could be wrong, but I made a note of it. I might have read it wrong.
My recommendation is that Ms. Kim is about to join us. I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted because we're trying to coordinate something via text for her to enter the meeting. So what we've left vague here is the criteria that I should use or anybody should use to review an appeal. So in the past, appeals have been limited to a review of the assignment of the scoring of the application. So a review of how the application was scored, and an explanation of how that, if the appeals, if those numbers turned out to be accurate, to just confirm that the process was followed according to policy. So we had a conversation early on about objectivity versus subjectivity. I struggle with this, and I'm gonna kind of boot it, frankly, over to you folks for some conversation. There are pros and cons to both approaches. So the objective review of an application is honestly limited. The superintendent didn't participate in the interview, so can't really check that score. The superintendent can check the grades, make sure the calculation was done, can check their attendance and make sure those numbers were accurate, can check their grades and make sure those numbers are accurate, and can read the local guidance counselor recommendation and make sure they would score it according to the same rubric, and be done with it. And if they agree, then the appeal is over. So that's one way, very cold and objective. But once you start increasing subjectivity into it, then this becomes, some folks would argue it becomes very concerning that someone with political connections could pressure a superintendent to let someone in. I can tell you that in the year and 3 months that I've been at Shawsheen, well, with this admissions process of our current freshman class, I received more than a handful of inquiries from elected officials, not school committee members, elected officials in our member communities asking for consideration of a waitlist applicant. So don't kid yourself that there's not political pressure applied to this thing. And I'm trying to, so this is the issue about subjectivity versus objectivity. And I know that some of you have tried to help constituents in the past and have found some frustration in the lack of the opportunity for subjectivity to be put into the appeals process. This is a good kid and blah, blah, blah. Or this is a kid who really needs a second start, or, I mean, there's 100 different reasons, and they're all legitimate. So my recommendation is a weak, admittedly, an objective review during the appeals process, because I think the potential for abuse, and I'll talk about myself as a superintendent. It is. I've been a superintendent for 18 years, and if a state rep called my office, called me on my cell phone and said, "Brad, this kid is blah, 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 blah," that puts a superintendent in an extremely difficult position. And I think you set up the potential for abuse and, frankly, the potential for privilege to enter into the conversation. And I would argue that one of the reasons we're doing this is to try to pull as much privilege out of the process as possible. But again, when you do that, you end up with a very weak but objective review criteria. Hold on. Christine has just joined us. All right, Christine is coming on board, folks. So with that, about the, I kind of throw it to you for your thoughts and conversation about this on a, more of a higher level, and then we can write the criteria based on, how you'd like that criteria to be reflected.
I agree about the objectivity. That I brought that up earlier in the selection process when we were talking about giving grades more weight than the interview. And this appeal system would be similar as far as the grades versus the subjectivity. I think it's difficult, but I tend to lean towards objectivity. Just as a general choice. I mean, I know it's more nuanced than that, but certainly not black and white.
No, and I think we do like the objectivity until we're confronted with the reality of a highly sympathetic or a situation that we think that the process didn't capture right, or maybe not everything got properly evaluated through no fault, but in recognition of the fact that the admissions group is handling a lot of people. And we are dealing with kids who are coming out of the 6th, 7th, and now 8th grade, and circumstances, and we can imagine many circumstances. I certainly agree with the superintendent. A call from a state rep or somebody just trying to exercise influence, because sometimes it might be done with the best of intentions. Sometimes it's being done because that's what they think their job is to exercise influence and give somebody the answer they want to hear. So I'm a little bit torn. I know there was, I can think of a situation where a superintendent, and I think you reflected on this, Superintendent Jackson, where he felt maybe too constrained by, the standards. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be an open, and numbers are going to come into it. And you could have, there's a few options that are coming to my mind. One would be superintendent hears an appeal. He or she might decide, rather, we can say the superintendent is the final, or perhaps the superintendent has some authority to remand to a committee of the admissions folks to say, look, there's just something I'd like you to look at again. Again, that's putting some burden on some folks that are already doing a lot of work. But I every time we say, well, I want to make it as limited as possible, we all know that there will be some circumstances that we find highly either sympathetic, or we think maybe something got missed in translation, and we as committee members or as community members, or just being concerned for kids, will say, but can't you look at this? and creating the dividing line between that and I'm rep, Joe Smith, and I've got 4 kids today from, name the town, that I'd like you to take a look at, because all of them contacted my office. There's very distinct types of situations there.
Could you tell me why the superintendent is now the appeals person as opposed to the principal/guidance? What made that change necessary?
This is actually the template from DESE that puts the superintendent as the appeals person. I don't know if it's in the regulations. I actually asked the question and I never got an answer back, if by regulation it has to be the superintendent, or there is, in some cases, in some districts, perhaps the principal is involved in the, maybe part of the interview committee or whatever. In some smaller regions, that may be the case. So perhaps the assumption was that the superintendent is traditionally not part of that. There's also kind of the traditional structure of appeals that the superintendent is traditionally the final appeal.
Yeah, I would think that would be the case if, in fact, it weren't resolved at a lower level with the principal, that it would ultimately come to the superintendent. But to go directly to the superintendent, bypassing the principal, I don't quite get. It seems to me the principal would know the process more intimately as part of the regular.
Well, again, part of this is, if it's an objective, make sure the numbers all add up correctly. You don't need to do that twice.
That's right.
If it's a subjective, once you add some level of subjectivity in there, you can, you probably want, I would argue, perhaps in a self-serving way, that the superintendent is probably more capable of maintaining objectivity and be a little more, I don't know what the word is, but a little more just don't, not as susceptible to political pressure, I guess. So as you were both talking, I had a thought here. So I'm trying to find a place that's a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll here. So what about having the appeal process be a review of all of the scores and a re-interview of the student by the superintendent who rescores the interview using that, using their current interview?
That's a lot of pressure
No.
in that interview process.
Well, again, this,
But that's what we're talking about, sort of the final effort here.
Yeah.
And
It would be fair. It would be another interview. And the student might be a little bit more practiced in the process. And I know my kids didn't interview well, so I'm very aware of the fact that some kids just don't interview well. And a second try might be fair.
yeah, and I'm trying to think of a situation, as a process. Again, on the one hand, we're dealing with the traditional admissions process, and then I also am trying to think of how we would want the superintendent or the team to handle, again, some other unusual circumstances, without going down some odd, like, for just as an example, a few years ago, our community, several years ago now, our community wound up taking in some kids who had been displaced by flooding in the South. And so suddenly there was several kids going to Bedford High who were, and it all worked out. They attended and made connections, etc. Great. If one of those kids that had come up here had been in a technical program in his or her community, we would be faced with the issue of, well, can we accept them? There were many circumstances that might cause either out of sequence or unusual admissions, or somebody who hasn't been here following a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade path. So I try to keep that in the back of the mind too. We wouldn't want them just to be accepted just because they're in a difficult set of circumstances. That wouldn't be fair or reasonable, but there might be extraordinary circumstances which would cause us to go to the superintendent. Again, I mention that because there needs to be some flexibility here, but also I think we would need to provide some guidance. We're assuming, this goes back to our zero-sum game discussions, at the point at which a student is appealing, that almost by definition means that all the slots have been taken, most likely, which means either we're expanding the number of slots, and then there's the issue of how many times you can do that. Does the superintendent get 5 extra admissions? Does he get 10? He or she get 10? So there's some other factors as to how that's going to be made.
So Brian, let me interrupt you there. So part of this process, as you can see in the top paragraph, is they have to file the appeal for admissions no later than 2 weeks after receipt of the decision.
Right.
So what traditional, we always have students who do not accept our acceptance.
Right.
So there is, we offer 360, 4 kids say no thank you, we take the next 4 off the waiting list. So we wouldn't start filling the waiting list until using the waiting list until this 2-week appeal period was done. Okay. So that process, it's a very fixed process. So there's a couple of things, and I know you're getting frustrated with me kicking the can down the road here, but
no.
There's a couple of issues here that are kind of elephants in the room here. So first of all, it's important to remember that we no longer have a cut score. So, and we no longer will count minor disciplinary infractions. We've also eliminated the difference in, we've actually made it review grades around 3 subjects instead of 4, and it's now pass fail and not A, B, C, or D. So some of the areas that have caused major drops in a student's score have been eliminated, particularly around the disciplinary process. The appeals that I would envision under this process would be not like the appeals that I experienced the one single appeal that I experienced last year, which was due to a cut score. But they're going to be much finer. You know, the admissions was we're now at a 65 and my student got a 64. Or they're 10th on the waiting list and we've only I'd move them up to 8th or whatever. So the adjustments are going to be much finer, I think. So I don't have I can't offer you, and perhaps I should try to maybe before we go too deep into this, and before we use a single example or a single experience that some of us have in common about an appeal from last year as kind of the driving force here, perhaps I can get some historical, how many appeals have we had? As I understand it, most of the appeals in the past have gone to the principal. The principal has confirmed that the scoring was accurate, and that was the end of the appeal. That's been our process thus far, as I understand it. And, there will no longer be because there's no cut score, we're only arguing now about where somebody is placed on the waiting list, as opposed to whether they're on the waiting list or just completely not eligible.
Right.
So the one appeal that I did review, because it involved a cut score, that review resulted in that student not being eligible for entry into Shawsheen. That will not be the case anymore because there's no cut score. So perhaps we, again, this may be a way that we need to kind of test out this new admissions process, see what results from it, and then adjust based on experience from this new process.
It would seem that one would want to convey that the appeal should be largely a matter of last resort or extraordinary circumstances, and that there's a standard that is relatively high. Just as in the law, there are people who think that appeals courts are there to relitigate your case from the beginning. And in fact, the appeals courts always remind people, no, it's to see if there was something procedurally defective, to the extent that usually it was something procedurally defective or something that was so inequitable or shocking of the conscience below, that we really can't let that happen, or there's just something that makes it an unusual set of circumstances, which I do believe should be with the superintendent, because I think there is even more susceptibility to pressure if it's the principal of the building.
Yeah, because the
But
superintendent can
setting that
exert
stand,
pressure
right,
on the
setting that
principal.
standard and expectations so that you don't have a situation where a very large number of people think, oh, we can go at it with an appeal. That they have to think that this is a high bar and probably doesn't have a lot of chance of success, but under very either specific circumstances or some very unusual or well-placed circumstances, there might be a way to get the superintendent to look at it, and or for him to reconvene the committee for a remand to the committee for reevaluation. But again, there would have to be some parameters, I think, just on numbers and other factors too, because yeah, if you got one appeal, it would be the easiest thing to do to say, okay, well, we'll do it. All right, fine. But it won't be just one, most likely. And that will make it tougher.
Mm.
I think it would be helpful to know, as you mentioned, Brad, how many appeals we might have had recently. I think I asked that question before, and how they were resolved.
All right, I'll try to get that for you. In the meantime, maybe, Brian, maybe you and I can work on some language that talks about a primarily objective review of the numbers, but leaves open some extraordinary circumstances.
Sure.
Is that kind of the consensus of the subcommittee?
I'm still leaning towards the objective, with the heart.
You can't have it both ways, Nancy.
Yeah, you can.
My heart and your heart are different hearts. That's when the subjectivity comes in.
Yeah.
All right, well, Brian and I mean, we have one more. This basically ends the review of this, the first full review that we've done of this document, I think. And then it basically, the same criteria for program admission to specific programs. This one, I suggest very strongly, is only objective. And then we have to maintain records, which is regulation. So that's the whole policy. Moving forward, I'd suggest that maybe Brian and I can try to play with some language around appeal criteria, and that we set up one more meeting for you folks to meet with the administrative team. And at that meeting, you can ask any, we can go back through the whole policy and ask questions if you have them that may be left over. And at that point in time, I would recommend that's the meeting that we might want to discuss the weights that we had proposed.
Ask you. Yeah.
Because we talked about it and we feel very comfortable with the recommendation we made originally. But we'd like, I think it would be nice. First of all, I think it's nice for you to get to know these folks and to hear their points of view. A lot of them have, Dave Norkowitz has been our vocational director for 20 years. So, and Jenna Lesko has been, kind of heading up the admissions process for 3 or 4. So, between those two administrators, they have a lot of personal experience with both the admissions process and the exploratory / shop selection process. Does that make sense for next steps?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask, have you had a meeting with the team since we met last week?
Yes,
So
that's
you
what I
have
was saying.
discussed it. Okay.
We did discuss it, and we prefer the team prefers the our original recommendation.
Okay.
And would like to just meet with you and discuss it and hear your thinking and you hear their thinking. Ultimately, it's your decision.
It's important to know what they're thinking. I would appreciate that.
Definitely. Maybe one sort of partially it's a philosophical question we might want to address to the team. Think about it in advance is because I think there will be members of the school committee and certainly members of the public that'll ask, how do we think, if at all, this new admissions policy as structured now will likely change the composition of the class or not? There might be a view that it will be procedurally better. We know some specific things you've highlighted, the lack of cut score, the de-emphasis on minor discipline. And I think a lot of people will see those as good things. But some people ask, well, will this make much of a difference in terms of who gets admitted or who does not get admitted? Or will it just be a different way of achieving a very similar class, but maybe some differences at the margin? And I think the other sort of issue that comes up is there was a lot of discussion when DESE was getting a lot of publicity earlier this year about changing policies. There was all kinds of public discussion and debate about, oh, maybe Voc schools should be going for complete open, lottery admissions, just pick names out of the hat. And other people were clamoring, oh no, we're watering down the standards. I think both of those were extreme and not necessarily helpful or realistic in terms of how people were interpreting what DESE was saying. But anyways, and I think as this is discussed publicly, we may get some similar comments or input, and people say, well, boy, are you not giving enough academic emphasis? Therefore, we're just making it more like an open-ended lottery. And other people saying, well, wait, and we should be doing more to go to address some of the issues DESE had. I see a lot of ways in which this addresses some of those issues. But I think that's something philosophically we may want to be ready to talk about with both the larger committee and with public members of the public who may ask about it.
And the tricky, I think that is a good question to ask both prospectively and retrospectively. I think that question is essential for the committee to ask next fall when you're reviewing this policy for the first time. What did this change? What do you think is going to happen is an important question. What did happen is also an important question. I can tell you that there is the biggest change we think we're making here is in the area of grades and the importance that grades has on 7th and 8th grade grades has on the admissions process. And there is fear that the level of academic preparation will be less so because of some of these changes we're making, which is one of the reasons why we did kind of a two-part switch. We put in pass-fail as opposed to A, B, C, D, or F, but we also lowered the points because we thought it was a less, and this is actually probably, I think this is one of the things you actually wanted to up, but we thought that the grades piece, scholastic achievement, is because it was a lower bar, should have a lower weight. So we are concerned about the quality of academic preparation that this selection process might yield. Again, a lot of this, but we also have to remember the history, that probably the most recent modification to this policy was made at a time when vocational school districts were under attack because of their MCAS scores, and were being typecast as places that where students were not being properly academically prepared. So a lot of school districts upped the level of weight that student scholastic achievement had in the admissions process, and kind of made it, and also improved its instruction and improved its focus on MCAS and brought the scores back up. But we're going to be taking one of those, make it a little less so. But I think that's a great conversation to have. This is the comparison that we talked about, Nancy. Can you see it on my screen?
Yeah.
The current policies on the left both add up to 100. And then a reminder that under the current policy, the cut score was 60. And there is no minimum now.
It's going to be interesting.
I can tell you, I meet with the vocational superintendents every week, and we're all doing the same thing. This is very, very similar to what a lot of districts are doing, particularly around the area of discipline, about basically making it 0 or 20 or 0 or something. We are where we are a little more, I will say, progressive, is in eliminating the variance between the letter grades of A, B, C, and D. And I think that's bolder than many school districts are doing. And putting more emphasis on the recommendation, which I think is a little bolder than more districts are doing, because we're trying to give, a voice to the sending districts about who they think should come. I can tell you that I can't think of a single district that has made the interview less important. There are several districts that are turning to 100% interview.
Wow. Oh, that's tough.
Well, I'm sorry, basically they're using discipline as a, like their discipline is 0 or 50, and then the interview is 50. So, and essentially the discipline becomes kind of a cut score in that situation, but which we think is, kind of inconsistent with the purpose. So, pardon me. So anyhow, so the next meeting, we need to set a date. What would you like to I'm happy to report out to the whole school committee on Tuesday about the progress. Would you just like me to make it a generic report? We've met twice. We've gone through the 12-page policy. We're about to meet a third time with the administrative team, and we hope to have a recommendation at the October meeting.
Yeah, and maybe mention a couple of the highlights, like the cut score and the, the changes that were required.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, me too. I just wanted to ask, I know I missed some stuff and I apologize to refer back in a long meeting like this. When you were, Nancy, when you're discussing the objectivity versus subjectivity, was it this section that you were speaking in regard to, or was it a different?
Well, initially I had talked
policy?
about it in the admissions part, but now we were talking about the appeals part. It keeps rearing its head.
Yeah, I agree. I like the objectivity as opposed to subjectivity more so, but I understand the need to also to have that subjectivity too, because it's not all about the numbers all of the time. And so I would like to, I'm with you on that. I just wanted to make sure that I was on the, I knew what you were talking about. And
well, I think it's a fine point. I mean, you put yourself in a parent's position. You know your kid, and you know they haven't presented well, and you want to fight. And I understand that. But I'm also, I just didn't like the skewing of the numbers, and skewing my word, not in the record. So, okay, so our meeting is going to be Tuesday in person or Zoom?
The school committee meeting is Tuesday at 7:30 in person
In person.
at Shawsheen Tech.
Okay.
And masks are required.
And at that time, would you be able to tell us when we might be able to meet with the team?
My suggestion is we select a date based on our availability, and as many of my teammates who are available will join us.
How many are there?
Well, there'll be, let's see, we had a group of about 7 of us. So Ms. Johnston, Ms. Lesko, Ms. Cook, Mr. Albert, Mr. Norkowitz, and myself. So there was 6 of us.
Oh, Christine, you were not here when I announced that Bob Peterson will no longer be part of the policy committee. He resigned because of his commitment to the superintendent search committee. He's the chair of that.
yes, it's a lot.
It is.
So what
Can we read
my
this
recommendation is to keep this just so we have how about, so we're meeting on the 28th, the school committee. How about if we meet on the 30th as a subcommittee? Are Thursdays bad for you, Christine? I know you had a conflict that went way over tonight.
Yes, and I'm the head coach. So I think today was exceptionally long, but I think 6 o'clock actually works better than the 5:30. The 5:30 time is a little too tight. But 6 o'clock should be okay for me.
Okay, it's okay with me.
You want to try for 6 p.m. on September 30th?
Yes.
And on that agenda, we will hopefully maybe Brian and I will have some brilliant statement that will tie this whole thing up in a nutshell. I'm relying on your legal expertise there, Brian. And
He's
then
riding on you, Brian. Big
I'll
bucks.
see what we can do, or we'll punt. No, we should be able to come up with something and, at least for discussion purposes.
Will that will be a Zoom meeting, Brad?
Yes, we'll make that 100% Zoom meeting like this. I think this meeting actually is easier for us and the public in this format because they get access to the actual document that you're working on. I actually think this type of work works very well through this medium. So 6 p.m. On September 30th is our next meeting. Before you adjourn, Madam Chair, you did
Minutes.
defer the minutes of September
right,
13th.
Could I propose the minutes to be reviewed and accepted? Any comments?
Motion to approve the minutes as prepared.
Somebody want to second it?
I'll second you.
Okay. So we have to vote. Mr. O'Donnell,
Yes.
Ms. Kim,
Yes.
and I agree. We are
Okay.
adjourned.
We need a motion to adjourn.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Passes. Oh, we have to do that at the vote too?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, Mr. O'Donnell,
Yes.
Ms. Kim,
Yes.
and I agree.
Thank you, everybody. This meeting is adjourned at 7:27 p.m. Hope
Thank
everybody has
you.
a great night.
Right. You
See you
too.
next
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.